both the FBI and the victim survey are estimates. They are counts based on a couple assumptions. One, the assumption that the people you're reaching out to and being surveyed in the case of victims are representative of Americans as a whole. The second thing is, when it comes to the FBI numbers, they only reflect one, what victims report to the police, and two, what the police report up to the FBI. So anywhere in that chain, if there's a miscommunication or data is mislabeled or just simply mischaracterized, you're going to inject errors and inconsistencies into the data. The transition to the new system, NIBRS, has been going on for decades, but so many agencies were not participating or participating fully that the FBI had to make it, in their view, mandatory. And that happened in 2021 because the old system was very limited in what data it collected, the counts of offenses and some basic demographic information about offenders and victims. The new system is much more detailed, has dozens of data points for every offense. And as a result, it's much more burdensome for both large and small departments to comply. So there was a huge gap in compliance when the first year of mandatory rollout happened in 2021. We saw participation drop from almost 90% to 60% in many agencies not complying. So the FBI decided to take a step back and say, you can use the old system if you need more time. And that's effectively what happened. We saw a number of agencies who were not complying, you begin to use the old system again and submit data. So NIBRS has more data and more detail is always better. More data, more detailed data is always better, but no data is worse than potentially limited data. There are unknown unknowns, and that's really what's at the base of this. The victimization survey and the Center for Disease Control's numbers on homicides diverge widely from the numbers put out by the FBI. That doesn't mean the FBI is wrong. It just means that the FBI is measuring something differently. And that different measurement means that it's hard to compare those. And I think in the words of the former LA police chief, Charlie Beck, said, crime is not measured by the FBI statistics. It's measured by what you feel like when you walk outside your door. So some people aren't reporting crime. Some people perceive crime to be higher than it is. And that perception becomes reality. So when we say that the estimates are off, all estimates are off. Inherently, they're estimates. And the FBI is now using estimates to get to a more accurate figure than the raw reporting totals. But that doesn't mean that they're more wrong or less wrong. It just means that they're still wrong. We know what we feel like about crime and what our safety level is. And that is what people are going to guide themselves by. So, we can talk about aggregate statistics, but your neighborhood, your own family is how you measure how safe you feel, not whether or not the FBI says Tuscaloosa, Alabama is more safe than it was 5 years ago. It's, do you feel safe now? And so the FBI's estimates about how safe we are or were are only as useful as if you feel that they track with your own perception. So the NIBRS numbers aren't better or worse per se. They are still flawed. And those flaws are concerning. Going through the data, I have found dozens of cities where the homicide numbers are off by 20% about what the city itself reported. For example, Chicago reported 499 homicides, according to the FBI in 2023. But according to the Chicago police, there were 617. That is 118 missing murders. That is 118 families who still lost a loved one last year that are still reeling from what happened, and they're not showing up in the FBI statistics. Would they be more consoled that their number would be there? No, but are we saying that the numbers that the FBI puts out are 100% accurate? Of course not, and demonstrably they're not. There's mistakes, there's missing data, and all of that has to be assumed when you look at FBI numbers. Are the trend lines going in the right direction? Yes. But were we at a really bad place? Absolutely. The way to think about this is it's as if you ascended Mount Everest and you descended to K2, the second tallest mountain in the world, and you said we're closer to the ground. A true but misleading statement. We are still at very elevated crime levels, and that's particularly the case in large urban centers. Chicago having 617 homicides last year, according to the police data, is a huge problem. That the FBI says it's lower than that doesn't change much on the ground in Chicago, but may change a national narrative. That the FBI has mistakes in it should be assumed, but it doesn't mean that we need to take anything at face value. It's likely that the FBI received data for only part of the year. So the offense counts that they reported out reflect either mislabeling by the FBI, where they made a mistake on the input side, or they had to extend out the analysis, which is they use the term estimation or inference, where they're guessing effectively what it would have been like in the rest of the year. So Chicago seems to have not given the FBI all the data because they couldn't comply with the NIBR's burden. And that's a problem because the burden is so high that Chicago said, we're not going to do it. And then the FBI has to guess. The FBI is doing audits every few years, going back and checking the data, but that doesn't mean they're doing it on a real-time or rolling basis. So you'll go back and look at the 2015 data, and it doesn't reflect what you saw then because they've changed it, because they've gotten new data about offenses, clearances, offender data, et cetera, from the departments. But again, that data is only as good as what's provided by the departments, and the departments have very little incentive or consequences for giving them bad data. And until that changes, we can't necessarily rely on that data being accurate. And one thing that's very important to note is the volume of violent crime, when we look at violent crime particularly, is 90% aggravated assaults and robberies. It is not rapes and murders, which make headlines. So any alteration in volume in those offenses completely washes out any change or problem in the total number of homicides. And the example to look at there is right now, Milwaukee Police Department reported 1,000 more aggravated assaults than the FBI tallies. 1,000, that's 20% more than what the FBI tallies. So the FBI has to either do an estimation or rely on bad data. Well, there were only 100 plus homicides in Milwaukee. So there are 10 times as many missing aggravated assaults as there are total homicides in Milwaukee. So for volume and scale, any change, even small change in those numbers is a problem. And we know, not to suggest that this is actually happening, but we know from 2005 to 2012, the Los Angeles Police Department systematically altered their crime data to diminish aggravated assaults, which are a serious felony violent crime, to make them into simple assaults. By doing so, they reduced overall violent crime dramatically in Los Angeles over that period. People got awards, people got bonuses, the city police budget went up. Everybody, basically threw a ticker tape parade for the LAPD, but they were juking the stats. If that is going on now, it would be very difficult to detect in FBI data. At the end of the day, all crime is local. It matters very little to me what crime is in Las Vegas, Nevada, if I'm never going to Las Vegas, Nevada. If I live in Philadelphia, I care not only what the overall crime rate in Philadelphia is, but what it is in my neighborhood. And is it going in the right direction? And are we doing anything about it? So at your local police department being transparent about crime in as real time as possible, and your local prosecutor being as transparent about how those prosecutions are going for those who are caught, is what matters to you. And so some of this is effectively academic. It's important that we talk about what's going on nationally in terms of crime, but all crime is local. In 2015, crime was at its nadir across the country, violent crime particularly. Homicides were 10,000 fewer than we had in 2021. That's just shocking, 40% below it. But Baltimore City saw homicides rise by 1/3 in 1 year. So what we know is that what happened in Baltimore didn't reflect what was happening in Memphis, what was happening in Cleveland. Something was going on in Baltimore that isn't reflected elsewhere. So your local conditions are what determine the crime situation. There's not some, bat signal for criminals all across the country saying, go do it, go attack someone, go shoot someone, go rob someone. It's that there's local conditions that are aggravating why crime is rising or falling. We need not only to incentivize local police departments, but honestly, we need to give them consequences for not complying. There are federal and local and state grants that are going to these departments. So we need to give them the resources to comply. But at the same time, if they still refuse to comply, when they have the necessary resources, there have to be consequences. And right now, there's lots of carrots, but not much of a stick. And so many of these agencies aren't complying. At the same time, you have to cooperate with them. I feel like NIBRS is a great example of where a good idea was imposed from the top and made mandatory without true consultation and working closely, collaborating with local authorities to find out if compliance was possible. And we found out the hard way it wasn't. And that means that the 2021 data is almost useless. It's all a guess and just riddled with errors. And so we really don't know how bad it was in 2021 because of that mandatory compliance. But to be fair to everybody in the process, to be fair, they're trying their best. And what's most valuable here is the fact that I can find out that the Chicago number doesn't match the FBI number, doesn't match the Illinois State Police number, is a testament to increasing transparency in crime data. This conversation could not have been had at a national level 20 years ago, let alone 50 years ago. We would only be guessing. Right now, we're arguing over methodology and data inputs, but there has been a transparency revolution, largely because of NYPD and Bill Bratton, who brought in the CompStat program, that has made every department, every major department in the country want to be transparent. And that transparency allows us to have these nibbling conversations about data inconsistencies. We at least have data now, and some data can be checked against other data to show what's actually happening. When we had no data, it was a complete black box. The NYPD's CompStat data of having real-time data is relatively new, really since the 80s, and it wasn't necessarily for public-facing purposes. It was for hotspot policing. It was for the police to know where things were happening and then put more resources there. And then in the 90s, as the internet came about and other means came about, the media got interested and the public got interested. So we have crime mapping tools and all these things happened in the last couple decades. Before that, the system, the UCR, started in the 1930s, but didn't get into any kind of quality control system until the late 50s and has been evolving since then. And NIBRS is supposed to be the new version of that. NIBRS is supposed to be the 21st century data collection system where we have so many data points, the time of day, the offender's age, all these little things that if you can aggregate and do statistical analysis of, you could see other trends that are below the surface. Right now, the inconsistencies and hiccups in that data are making a good idea look like a bad one. The blame is that the FBI needs better quality controls in place in terms of accepting data. Right now, they're accepting it on face value. There isn't necessarily documentation. They're saying, self-report what you have. And because it's such a monumental task, there are 19,000 law enforcement agencies reporting. That may be overwhelming for them and would be very costly for them to put in proper data and quality controls. And they're not doing it. They're just basically taking them at their word. And in some cases, they're getting data that reflects 9 months of data. And the FBI, for whatever reason, didn't check that it didn't make sense, or alternatively, accidentally imported it as a full year. And we saw that in 2022 in St. Louis. They put in 9 months of data as 12 months. So the data didn't match. St. Louis had a dramatic decline in homicides, robberies, rapes, and aggravated assaults. It didn't happen. It was a mirage because of a data entry error. And without quality controls, you're going to keep seeing that over and over again. So it's the FBI's fault in the sense they don't have quality controls. It's obviously the department's fault that they're putting forward bad data or they're not doing quality controls. And it's everybody's fault that they weren't collaborating from the beginning in a meaningful way and that they're not both a carrot and a stick for complying. The only way to really measure crime is to look at all the measures and see if there's a trend line or a story, or if there's something that can explain the gap in information. And so when we don't have an explanation for what is going on, it doesn't mean it's a conspiracy. It doesn't mean that there's some malintent. It just means there's either incompetence or overburdened departments or FBI statisticians or whatnot. When you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. The likelihood there's a massive conspiracy at the FBI statistics division is absurd. Somebody would come out and blow the whistle on that. But some people want to drink the Kool-Aid that everything that the government's doing is bad or evil. These are bureaucrats who are just trying to do their best. They have limited resources, limited time, and sometimes they make mistakes. And the NIBRS transition has been proven to be a mistake, at least at the mandatory level.